What if the Red Army's victory was shaped not only on the front lines, but by armed NKVD troops standing behind their own soldiers? And what if the same forces that enforced discipline in 1942 later reshaped the entire post-war order in Eastern Europe? The story of the barrier troops is not just about control. It is about how a hidden system of power influenced millions and changed the map of Europe itself. The emergence of NKVD barrier troops during the early stages of the German-Soviet War must be understood within the broader context of the Soviet Union's political system, military doctrine, and the catastrophic conditions that unfolded after June 22, 1941. The Soviet state, shaped by decades of centralized rule under Joseph Stalin, relied heavily on coercive institutions to maintain discipline in both civilian and military spheres. The NKVD, responsible for internal security, counterintelligence, and political repression, entered the war with a well-established infrastructure designed to enforce loyalty and eliminate perceived threats. As the Red Army confronted unprecedented military defeats during the first months of Operation Barbarossa, these structures were expanded into the battlefield environment, forming the basis for what became known as barrier troops. The geopolitical background of this development was defined by the rapid deterioration of Soviet defensive lines in the summer of 1941. German army groups north, center, and south advanced hundreds of kilometers within weeks, destroying or encircling more than 100 Soviet divisions. According to Soviet archival figures, the Red Army lost approximately 2.3 million personnel killed, missing, or captured between June and September 1941. Entire armies disappeared from the front, and retreating Soviet units often lacked coherent command structures or reliable communication with higher headquarters. In this environment, both Soviet leadership and the NKVD concluded that extraordinary measures were needed to stabilize collapsing fronts and prevent further disintegration. National interests and ideological motivations played a central role. The Soviet leadership viewed the war not only as a military struggle, but as a political contest for survival. Stalin's 1941 directives emphasized that unauthorized withdrawal, desertion, or panic threatened the integrity of the entire state. Within this framework, strict discipline became a strategic priority. NKVD organs were tasked with enforcing order behind the lines, identifying deserters, screening retreating troops, and preventing what the Soviet leadership considered the spread of defeatism. The decision to create barrier detachments was therefore rooted in the belief that maintaining discipline under extreme conditions required coercive force. Military preparedness and intelligence estimates also contributed to the rise of barrier troops. Soviet intelligence had failed to accurately assess the scale and velocity of the German offensive, leading to widespread confusion during the first months of the war. Red Army units lacked adequate training, equipment, and logistical support. Many formations entered combat with reduced ammunition stocks, incomplete mobilization, and inexperienced officers. Under these pressures, instances of unauthorized retreats increased sharply. Reports submitted to the Stavka described divisions abandoning defensive positions without orders, often due to breakdowns in communication or the sudden collapse of neighboring units. NKVD leadership argued that placing armed detachments behind the front was necessary to protect strategic positions from being abandoned prematurely. Public sentiment during this period reflected the chaos of the front. Civilians in newly invaded regions were caught between advancing German forces and retreating Soviet units. NKVD officials feared that the disorder might fuel anti-Soviet attitudes or lead to collaboration. Barrier units were therefore also instructed to control refugee flows, secure transportation routes, and prevent civilians from interfering with military operations. This dual mission, controlling soldiers and civilians alike, illustrated the Soviet state's reliance on the NKVD as a central pillar of wartime governance. The formalization of barrier troops occurred on July 27, 1941, with the issuance of NKVD Order No. 00941, which authorized internal troops to form special detachments tasked with screening and detaining military personnel retreating without authorization. These early formations were small, typically consisting of a few hundred men per army sector, equipped with light machine guns and tasked primarily with identifying stragglers. Their role expanded dramatically after the promulgation of Stalin's Order Number 227 on July 28, 1942, known for its statement, "Not one step back." This directive explicitly mandated the creation of blocking detachments within each army, with the specific purpose of preventing unauthorized withdrawals. By the second half of 1942, Soviet internal troop reports documented the deployment of approximately 193 barrier detachments and blocking units across multiple fronts. These units were not created as substitutes for regular military troops, but as instruments of political discipline. They operated independently from Red Army command structures and reported directly to NKVD leadership. Their presence behind the lines represented the Soviet leadership's belief that enforcing discipline required constant political supervision. Barrier troops were therefore positioned at key junctions, roadways, and river crossings to intercept retreating soldiers, reorganize fragmented units, and ensure that only authorized withdrawals occurred. In assessing the preconditions and context of NKVD barrier troops, it is essential to understand that their emergence reflected the interaction of military collapse, political authoritarianism, and urgent strategic necessity. The Soviet Union, facing a rapidly advancing enemy and unprecedented losses, turned to its most coercive institution to restore order at the front. Barrier troops became both a symbol and a tool of this approach, enforcing discipline through surveillance, force, and the constant threat of punishment. Their creation set the stage for a controversial and complex chapter in Soviet wartime history, one that would influence Red Army operations from 1941 to 1944 and leave a lasting mark on interpretations of Soviet military discipline. The establishment of NKVD barrier troops moved from concept to full operational deployment during the first major crises of the German-Soviet War. As the front continued to collapse throughout the second half of 1941, Soviet leaders issued a series of emergency directives that expanded the authority, scope, and structure of these detachments. Their integration into frontline operations represented a significant shift in Soviet military organization. The NKVD, previously focused on internal security and counterintelligence, now exercised direct coercive oversight over Red Army units engaged in combat. The opening phase of their deployment illustrates how the Soviet state responded to the initial disaster of Operation Barbarossa through mechanisms of strict discipline and centralized control. The first barrier detachments began operating immediately after the release of NKVD Order No. 00941 on July 27, 1941. Internal troop commanders were instructed to form special groups at critical points behind the front to screen retreating soldiers and identify deserters. These detachments typically consisted of 200 to 300 NKVD personnel per Army sector, armed with rifles, light machine guns, and communication equipment. Their initial mission focused on filtration, collecting stragglers, verifying documents, and separating wounded personnel from those who were retreating without cause. Reports from the Western Front indicate that during August 1941, NKVD detachments detained thousands of soldiers who had been cut off during encirclements or who had abandoned their formations during chaotic retreats. As German forces moved deeper into Soviet territory, the need for more coordinated control became urgent. Red Army headquarters frequently lost contact with frontline divisions due to the destruction of communications infrastructure and rapid enemy advances. In many cases, entire regiments withdrew without receiving formal orders, creating gaps that German armored units exploited. In response, the NKVD expanded its deployment to major road junctions, bridges, and railroad stations to intercept military personnel leaving the front. An NKVD report from September 1941 noted that in a single week, barrier units on the Bryansk front detained more than 20,000 men, including soldiers, officers, and reservists. Many were reorganized into marching battalions and sent back to their parent units. Key figures in this phase included Lavrenti Beria, the People's Commissar of Internal Affairs, who oversaw the entire operation, and Ivan Serov, a senior NKVD official responsible for coordinating barrier troop deployment. Their directives emphasized that unauthorized withdrawal was to be treated as a threat equivalent to sabotage or espionage. At the front, barrier detachments were led by NKVD officers with extensive experience in internal security operations. These officers were instructed to act decisively to halt retreats, using weapons if necessary. Red Army commanders, already under severe pressure, often viewed barrier troops with apprehension, but relied on them to restore broken formations. The opening phase of barrier troop operations became more structured after the issuance of Order No. 227 on July 28, 1942. This directive formalized the creation of blocking detachments within every army of the Red Army. It specified that each front must establish between 3 and 5 such detachments, each equipped with submachine guns, rifles, and transport vehicles. Unlike earlier formations, these detachments were integrated into frontline command structures, but remained operationally subordinate to NKVD headquarters. Their mission expanded beyond filtration to include preventing unauthorized withdrawals during active combat and supporting commanders in maintaining order under extreme conditions. During this transitional phase, barrier troops participated directly in preventing the abandonment of defensive positions. In several documented cases, NKVD detachments positioned themselves behind Red Army battalions engaged in holding key river lines. Their presence acted as a deterrent against panic during German armored assaults. German commanders took note of the appearance of barrier troops during interrogations of captured Soviet soldiers. Interrogation reports from October 1941 recorded instances where Soviet personnel described NKVD detachments blocking roads behind defensive lines and threatening to open fire on soldiers retreating without orders. German intelligence assessments concluded that these units played a significant role in preventing the complete disintegration of Soviet defensive sectors, particularly during the encirclements around Vyazma and Bryansk. Red Army leadership had mixed reactions to the deployment of NKVD barrier troops. Some commanders welcomed their assistance in reorganizing retreating soldiers and restoring order after breakthroughs. Others argued that the presence of armed NKVD units behind the lines created tension and distrust among frontline troops. Nonetheless, the Soviet High Command considered barrier detachments essential tools for maintaining operational stability during the most critical moments of the war. By the conclusion of the opening phase, the framework for NKVD barrier troop operations was firmly established. They had evolved from small filtration teams into integrated security formations with clearly defined responsibilities within the broader Red Army command system. Their activities reflected the dual pressures of military necessity and political control that characterized Soviet wartime governance. The stage was now set for their expanded role during the major battles of 1942 and 1943, when the Red Army's discipline and cohesion would be tested further by the demands of prolonged large-scale operations. In 1942, Stavka sought to prevent a recurrence of these events by ensuring that every army possessed structures capable of intercepting retreating soldiers, reorganizing broken units, and maintaining pressure to hold positions. NKVD barrier detachments thus became an integral component of this strategy. Their mission centered on preventing the sudden collapse of defensive lines by acting as a final layer of enforcement behind the front. They were instructed not only to stop retreats, but also to redirect soldiers back into battle or to field headquarters where they could be reassigned. Logistical considerations were crucial to this approach. The Soviet Union suffered severe manpower shortages in early 1942 due to the unprecedented losses of the previous year. Replacing entire divisions was no longer viable at the same rate. Instead, preserving existing formations became a strategic priority. Barrier troops were expected to return the maximum number of retreating soldiers to combat duty, effectively serving as a mechanism for manpower conservation. Reports from the Stalingrad front during the summer of 1942 recorded more than 140,000 personnel intercepted by barrier detachments, with approximately 80% returned to their units after screening. This process ensured that the Red Army maintained fighting strength even under intense operational pressure. Military doctrine also played a significant role. Soviet commanders recognized that defensive operations required strict adherence to orders, especially when holding river lines, fortified positions, or key logistical nodes. The doctrine articulated in Order Number 227 emphasized the importance of not one step back, reflecting both strategic necessity and ideological resolve. Barrier troops became the institutional embodiment of this doctrine, serving as instruments of physical deterrence. Their presence at critical defensive positions, often located behind battalions tasked with holding ground, represented the practical enforcement of Soviet doctrine and the state's willingness to apply coercive methods to maintain discipline. Propaganda contributed to the formalization of barrier detachments by framing them as protectors of the homeland rather than punitive instruments. Soviet newspapers and political officers described barrier troops as units tasked with defending the rear from saboteurs, enemy infiltrators, and panic spreaders. Posters and political education lectures emphasized that retreating without orders aided the enemy and undermined the sacrifices of frontline troops. By integrating this message into the ideological framework of the Red Army, the state sought to normalize the presence of armed NKVD units behind the front and to justify their function within the broader narrative of wartime vigilance. Operational planning further expanded the responsibilities of barrier troops. As Soviet forces prepared for major defensive operations around Stalingrad, Voronezh, and the Caucasus, NKVD detachments were assigned not only to intercept retreating soldiers, but also to assist in reorganizing disrupted units. Many detachments included political officers, medics, and clerks capable of registering stragglers, identifying specialists, and sending them to appropriate command centers. This organizational capability proved vital during the chaotic fighting around Stalingrad in September and October 1942, when several divisions suffered extensive losses in communications and command staff. Barrier troops created temporary collection points where soldiers arriving from encircled areas could be reassigned to reinforce nearby units. Strategic planning documents show that the Soviet leadership recognized the limitations of barrier troops, but considered them indispensable. German commanders noted that Soviet forces held positions with greater determination than in 1941, attributing this in part to the presence of barrier units. While these assessments often overstated the role of coercion in Soviet discipline, they underscored the strategic significance the Wehrmacht attributed to NKVD detachments. Internal Soviet discussions, however, reveal that the expansion of barrier troops was also driven by political concerns. Stalin and the NKVD leadership viewed the front as a potential source of ideological instability. High casualties, disorganized retreats, and the proximity of soldiers to occupied territories raised fears of defeatism and treason. Barrier troops, therefore, served as instruments of political surveillance as much as military enforcement. Their reports included assessments of morale, rumors among soldiers, complaints about command decisions, and evidence of anti-Soviet sentiment. This information was relayed to political departments and used to guide disciplinary actions across entire armies. Strategic miscalculations accompanied this system. In some sectors, especially during the fighting around Rzhev in late 1942, the presence of barrier troops created tension between Red Army and NKVD officers. Some commanders objected to the placement of NKVD detachments too close to frontline positions, arguing that it eroded trust and reduced unit cohesion. Although these concerns were acknowledged in internal correspondence, Soviet leadership maintained that the benefits of strict enforcement outweighed the potential drawbacks. By the end of 1942, the strategic framework of NKVD barrier troops had been fully incorporated into Soviet operational planning. They functioned as logistical stabilizers, political overseers, and enforcers of discipline, roles shaped by the demands of a war that required absolute commitment from every soldier. Their presence reflected a system in which military strategy and political control were inseparable, setting the stage for their involvement in some of the most critical battles of 1943. The first major confrontations involving NKVD barrier troops emerged during the intense fighting of 1942 and early 1943, when the Red Army faced a series of large-scale engagements that tested the limits of its discipline, cohesion, and command structure. These battles revealed how barrier detachments functioned in practice, how they intercepted retreating personnel, restored disorganized formations, and responded to unexpected battlefield crises. Their work during this period unfolded against the backdrop of the Red Army's transition from defensive desperation toward the beginnings of strategic recovery. The fighting around Stalingrad in the summer and autumn of 1942 offers the clearest early example of barrier troops operating during major combat operations. As Soviet forces attempted to halt the German Sixth Army's advance toward the Volga, NKVD detachments established blocking points along key access routes, including the approaches to the city's industrial districts. Reports from the Stalingrad Front document that between August and September 1942, barrier units detained more than 36,000 soldiers who had become separated from their units or attempted to withdraw from untenable positions without explicit orders. Of these, more than 30,000 were screened and returned to combat roles after verification, while approximately 5,000 were sent to penal battalions formed under the provisions of Order No. 227. These figures underscore the operational realities of early engagements. Many of the soldiers intercepted were not attempting to desert. Rather, they had been dislocated during urban fighting or forced back by German armored thrusts. NKVD detachments often found themselves processing large groups of disoriented personnel rather than dealing with deliberate retreat. Nonetheless, their work ensured that thousands of troops who might otherwise have been lost to the Soviet command structure were quickly reintegrated into nearby defensive positions. The first clashes in the Caucasus Campaign of 1942 further illustrated the role of barrier troops during unexpected setbacks. As German Army Group A advanced through the Kuban region toward the oil fields of Grozny and Baku, several Soviet divisions fell back rapidly to avoid encirclement. Barrier detachments stationed along major river crossings such as the Terek and Baksan intercepted retreating soldiers, redirecting combat-capable personnel toward hastily organized defensive lines. NKVD reports from the North Caucasus Front in September 1942 recorded more than 12,000 soldiers detained in a 2-week period, with the majority returned to active fighting after unit identification procedures. These operations were critical in stabilizing the front during moments when Red Army formations were in danger of dissolving. Without the presence of barrier detachments, Soviet commanders likely would have faced greater difficulty regrouping scattered units and re-establishing coherent line formations in mountainous and disrupted terrain. In early 1943, during the aftermath of the encirclement of German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, NKVD barrier troops participated in operations to secure newly liberated territories. As the Red Army advanced westward across the Don and toward Kharkiv, retreating Soviet troops from earlier battles began reappearing behind the lines. NKVD detachments screened these personnel, distinguishing between stragglers, escaped prisoners, and soldiers who had become separated from their units during the fighting. According to NKVD records from the Voronezh front, more than 22,000 returning soldiers were processed in January and February 1943, with over 90% reintegrated into Red Army formations. The Kharkiv counteroffensive launched by German forces in February and March 1943 provided another example of barrier troops responding to battlefield crises. When the SS Panzer Corps recaptured Kharkiv and pushed Soviet units back toward the Donets River, NKVD barrier detachments established defensive checkpoints along the main retreat routes. Their purpose was to prevent uncontrolled withdrawal that could lead to additional encirclements. During this period, barrier troops detained approximately 14,000 Red Army soldiers in the area surrounding Belgorod and Chuhuiv. The majority were reorganized into reserve battalions, while several hundred who had abandoned their weapons or equipment were referred to military tribunals. Civilian populations were deeply affected by the operations of barrier troops during these first major engagements. Refugees fleeing frontline areas often moved along the same roads used by retreating soldiers, creating congestion that hindered the movement of reinforcements. NKVD units enforced strict separation between civilian and military traffic, redirecting or restricting civilian movement, to ensure that military convoys could pass unimpeded. In the Stalingrad region, NKVD detachments escorted groups of displaced civilians toward evacuation centers on the east bank of the Volga. Their reports highlight concerns that uncontrolled refugee flows might facilitate the infiltration of German intelligence agents or allow the spread of rumors that could damage morale. The morale impact of barrier troop operations varied widely. Some Red Army soldiers viewed the presence of NKVD detachments as a guarantee that their units would not collapse under pressure, providing reassurance that all forces shared responsibility for holding the line. Others experienced barrier troops as symbols of distrust, associating them with potential punishment rather than support. Political officers attempted to mitigate this tension through targeted propaganda, emphasizing that barrier units were intended to maintain discipline, not to punish ordinary soldiers. Nonetheless, frontline diaries and post-war testimonies reveal that NKVD presence generated fear among some troops, especially those who had previously served in units that experienced heavy attrition or chaotic retreats. Unexpected outcomes also occurred. In certain cases, barrier detachments found themselves forced into direct combat when German breakthroughs threatened their forward positions. During the fighting near the Don in late 1942, several NKVD units engaged German infantry and armored spearheads after Red Army defenses collapsed. NKVD casualties during these engagements were significant. Records indicate that internal troop detachments lost more than 1,200 personnel in frontline combat between August 1942 and March 1943. These incidents demonstrated that barrier troops could not always remain behind the front and at times were absorbed into defensive actions alongside regular forces. By the end of these early engagements, barrier troops had proven effective in restoring order during crises, but also revealed the complexities of enforcing discipline in a rapidly changing operational environment. They became an essential component of the Soviet state's ability to maintain control during some of the most volatile battles of the war. Their involvement in Stalingrad, the Caucasus, and the Kharkiv operations set the foundation for their expanded role in subsequent campaigns, where the stakes would grow even higher as the Red Army transitioned from defensive operations to strategic offensives across the Eastern Front. The expansion of NKVD barrier troop activity reached a critical phase during the major Soviet crises of 1943, particularly in the aftermath of German counteroffensives at Kharkiv and during the early stages of the Battle of Kursk. As the Red Army attempted to consolidate its gains from the winter offensives, it confronted a series of operational challenges: rapid shifts in frontline positions, shortages of trained manpower, logistical strain, and fluctuating morale among exhausted formations. These pressures created conditions in which barrier detachments were increasingly mobilized, not only for rear area control, but also for stabilizing collapsing sectors during moments of acute operational danger. The Third Battle of Kharkiv in February-March 1943 provided one of the first major crises of this period. Following the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, Red Army forces advanced rapidly into eastern Ukraine, capturing Kharkiv on February 16th. However, the rapid Soviet advance overstretched supply lines and left several units under strength and poorly positioned for defense. When German forces under the command of Army Group South launched a counteroffensive on February 19th, the Soviet front began to unravel. NKVD reports from the southwestern and Voronezh fronts describe widespread confusion. Divisions that had advanced up to 150 kilometers in less than a month suddenly found themselves facing concentrated German armored attacks with insufficient artillery support. Barrier detachments stationed behind the Soviet spearheads were immediately thrust into crisis management roles. During the retreat toward the Donets River, NKVD units established makeshift defensive checkpoints to prevent the disorganized withdrawal from turning into a full collapse. Between February 20th and March 10th, barrier detachments on the Voronezh front detained approximately 21,000 soldiers who had become separated from their units or abandoned their positions under pressure from German SS divisions. These soldiers were processed at field filtration points, where NKVD officers screened them for potential disciplinary violations before reallocating the majority to reserve battalions. Approximately 2,000 soldiers unable to identify unit affiliation were integrated into penal companies for frontline deployment, reflecting the urgent need to rebuild shattered formations. The crisis intensified as German forces recaptured Kharkiv on March 14th. NKVD detachments continued operating along key transportation routes to support reorganization efforts. They secured railway junctions used to transport reinforcements, isolated damaged divisions to facilitate reconstitution, and prevented logistical corridors from becoming overwhelmed by refugees and retreating troops. NKVD internal reports noted that these actions helped maintain enough order for the Red Army to re-establish a stable defensive line along the Seversky Donets by late March, preventing further German exploitation of the breakthrough. Meanwhile, in the southern sector of the front, the Red Army faced renewed threats during the battles for the Kuban and the approaches to the Caucasus. Soviet forces attempting to encircle German positions in the Taman Peninsula encountered stiff resistance, and several divisions suffered heavy casualties. Barrier troops in this region were tasked with preventing unauthorized withdrawals from forward positions, defending key river crossings. Reports from the North Caucasus Front indicate that in April and May 1943, barrier detachments screened more than 15,000 soldiers during the fighting along the Kuban line. Many of these soldiers had become separated from their units in marshy or forested terrain, where maintaining cohesion was particularly difficult. NKVD soldiers were often forced to intervene directly, organizing groups of stragglers into ad hoc defensive teams until regular command structures could be restored. The looming Battle of Kursk in summer 1943 further shaped barrier troop deployment. Soviet High Command recognized that the German offensive would test not only the strength of Soviet defensive belts, but also the discipline of frontline troops. In preparation, each Soviet army deployed multiple NKVD barrier detachments directly behind key defensive sectors, railway lines, and logistical hubs. Their mission was to ensure that Soviet troops held their fortified positions despite intense German pressure. During the initial German attacks on July 5th, barrier troops documented heavy flows of wounded, disoriented, and temporarily retreating infantry attempting to regroup behind the primary defensive belts. Over the course of the first week of the battle, NKVD reports from the Central and Voronezh fronts recorded the interception of more than 30,000 personnel. Of these, approximately 80% were returned to their units after receiving medical assistance or reorganization, reflecting the extremely high stress placed on Soviet infantry during these engagements. Barrier troops also worked to suppress incidents of panic that erupted during German breakthroughs in the southern sector of the Kursk salient. When elements of the 2 SS Panzer Corps advanced near Prokhorovka on July 11th, several Soviet rifle regiments reported breakdowns in communication and confusion over retreat orders. NKVD detachments stationed behind these lines intervened by halting disorganized movements and directing soldiers toward established reserve positions. In one documented case, an NKVD detachment of 150 men successfully reorganized more than 800 retreating soldiers from 2 rifle divisions, enabling their redeployment in the counterattacks that followed the clash at Prokhorovka. The crisis phase of 1943 also saw a shift in the types of personnel processed by barrier troops. With the Red Army suffering high casualty rates, particularly in rifle divisions that often operated at 50 to 60% of authorized strength, many intercepted soldiers were exhausted, shell-shocked, or suffering from battlefield disorientation rather than lacking discipline. NKVD medical reports from Kursk documented high rates of combat fatigue, dehydration, and concussion among detained personnel. As a result, barrier detachments increasingly included medical staff capable of evaluating soldiers for return to duty or transfer to field hospitals. This adaptation reflected the changing nature of Soviet manpower management as the Red Army prepared for counteroffensives later in the year. German accounts from 1943 acknowledged the operational impact of barrier troops. Wehrmacht intelligence summaries noted that despite heavy casualties, Soviet units held defensive lines longer than expected and frequently launched counterattacks with forces that appeared to have been reorganized from shattered formations. This assessment suggests that NKVD efforts to collect and reassemble retreating soldiers played a role in preserving Soviet defensive capacity during critical phases of the Kursk campaign. By the end of 1943, the crisis-driven deployment of barrier troops had demonstrated both the harsh realities of Soviet discipline enforcement and the effectiveness of these measures in preventing operational collapse. Their presence during the Kharkiv retreat and Kursk defensive battles contributed to stabilizing Soviet lines at pivotal moments, ensuring that the Red Army could transition from defensive operations to large-scale offensives that would soon carry it into Ukraine, Belarus, and beyond. Their role during this period underscored the intense pressures placed on Soviet forces and the measures the state employed to keep them fighting during some of the war's most volatile and decisive campaigns. The role of NKVD barrier troops reached its peak during the largest Soviet operations of 1943 and 1944, when the Red Army transitioned from strategic defense to sustained offensive warfare across the Eastern Front. During this period, the NKVD's enforcement apparatus operated on an unprecedented scale, often shadowing entire armies as they advanced through liberated and contested territories. The intensity of combat, the speed of Soviet offensives, and the enormous movement of troops and civilians all contributed to circumstances in which barrier detachments were tasked with maintaining order, preventing unauthorized withdrawals, and securing the rear during some of the most intense fighting of the war. Their actions during these peak campaigns reveal the full extent of their integration into Soviet wartime command and illustrate the complex ways in which they influenced operational outcomes. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 marked the beginning of barrier troops' most extensive period of deployment. Once the German offensive had been halted, the Red Army launched a series of coordinated counteroffensives, Operations Kutuzov and Rumyantsev, intended to destroy German forces withdrawing from the salient and to recapture key cities such as Orel, Belgorod, and Kharkiv. These operations involved millions of soldiers moving across wide sectors of the front, creating major challenges for maintaining discipline, securing supply lines, and preventing disintegration during breakthroughs or prolonged engagements. During the Orel offensive, Operation Kutuzov, NKVD detachments followed closely behind attacking formations to intercept stragglers, reorganize scattered units, and prevent unauthorized looting in recently liberated settlements. Reports from the Western and Bryansk fronts indicate that between July and August 1943, barrier troops detained approximately 48,000 personnel who had become separated from their units in the fluid combat conditions. Most were quickly returned to reserve battalions or directed toward their parent regiments. The rapid pace of Soviet advances required barrier detachments to establish temporary filtration points in forests, rural villages, and along destroyed transportation routes. These measures ensured that the Red Army's forward momentum was not undermined by the logistical chaos that often accompanies large-scale offensive operations. The recapture of Kharkiv in August 1943 presented a different kind of challenge. The city had changed hands multiple times during the war, and fighting during its final liberation created extensive urban destruction and confusion among both soldiers and civilians. NKVD barrier units established cordons around key districts to prevent unauthorized withdrawals from frontline positions, to secure medical evacuation routes, and to direct stragglers toward reorganization centers. During the intense street fighting that preceded the city's recapture, NKVD reports documented more than 17,000 intercepted personnel. Many of these soldiers had been dispersed during German counterattacks or had entered the city ahead of their units during rapid advances. The ability of NKVD detachments to reorganize these scattered elements contributed to the stabilization of Soviet lines inside the city. Barrier troops assumed an even greater role during the massive Soviet offensives of 1944, operations such as the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive, the Dnieper-Carpathian offensive, Operation Bagration, and the Vistula-Oder offensive involved rapid advances across hundreds of kilometers. These offensives required strict coordination and discipline to maintain offensive pressure, prevent gaps in the line, and manage the increasing number of German prisoners and displaced civilians moving through the rear areas. In early 1944, during the liberation of right bank Ukraine, NKVD detachments operated behind advancing Soviet forces to prevent isolated retreats during German counterattacks. For example, during the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky encirclement in February 1944, Soviet units faced several intense local crises as German forces launched efforts to break out. NKVD detachments on the 1st and 2nd Ukrainian fronts intercepted approximately 22,000 soldiers during that operation. Many of these had become separated during night fighting or local withdrawals. The presence of barrier troops reduced the risk of panic spreading through rear echelons as German armored groups attempted to break the encirclement. Operation Bagration in summer 1944 marked the zenith of barrier troop deployment due to the operation's size and speed. As 4 Soviet fronts advanced more than 500 kilometers, destroying Army Group Center, the NKVD was tasked with screening enormous flows of military and civilian personnel. According to archival NKVD figures, between June and September 1944, barrier detachments across all fronts detained more than 157,000 Soviet soldiers. Of these, more than 130,000 were returned to their units after verification, while the remainder were transferred to penal units or held for further investigation. These numbers underscore the chaotic nature of large-scale offensives, where even successful advances produce disorganization among attacking forces. Barrier troops also played key roles in rear area security during this period. As Soviet forces liberated Belarus and eastern Poland, NKVD detachments were assigned to suppress sabotage, secure railway junctions, and screen civilians suspected of collaboration. These activities sometimes intersected with local partisan movements, requiring coordination between NKVD officers and partisan commanders. The movement of millions of civilians behind the front increased the complexity of these operations, forcing NKVD personnel to balance rear security with the logistical demands of large-scale refugee flows. The Warsaw-Lublin offensive of July 1944 introduced additional pressures. As Soviet and Polish forces advanced toward the Vistula, NKVD barrier troops screened thousands of soldiers from units that had been overextended during rapid river crossings. They also served as a stabilizing force during the initial stages of the Lublin Committee's establishment, policing rear areas under new political administration. Their presence at key junctures ensured that Soviet military authority remained organized despite rapidly shifting front lines. In Romania and Bulgaria, during late summer 1944, NKVD barrier detachments again operated behind Soviet units advancing into the Balkans. Their mission included screening retreating enemy soldiers, preventing unauthorized withdrawal from Soviet formations crossing the Danube, and managing the capture and processing of German and Hungarian prisoners. NKVD internal documents from the 3rd Ukrainian Front recorded the detention of more than 19,000 Soviet personnel during the first month of the Balkan offensives. The peak of barrier troop involvement revealed the full scope of their wartime function. They enforced discipline during prolonged operations, reorganized dislocated military personnel, prevented localized collapses during counterattacks, managed civilian and prisoner flows, and provided rear area security in newly liberated territories. Their role expanded with the scale of Soviet operations, and their activities became indispensable to sustaining offensive momentum during some of the most complex and high-intensity campaigns of the war. By the end of 1944, the NKVD's barrier units had become a permanent feature of the Red Army's operational architecture. Their presence reflected the Soviet leadership's belief that large-scale warfare required not only military strength, but also a robust system of coercive control to maintain discipline and order. Their work during the peak of the campaign laid the foundation for their actions during the final battles of 1945, when the war reached its climactic end in Central Europe. As the Red Army advanced westward during late 1944 and early 1945, the role of NKVD barrier troops evolved once more. The crisis-driven interventions that had characterized earlier stages of the war were replaced by a broader mix of defensive oversight, counterintelligence work, and adaptive responses to the changing operational landscape. Although the Red Army was now moving steadily toward victory, conditions on the ground remained volatile. German forces launched localized counterattacks, Frontline cohesion fluctuated under the strain of rapid advances, and newly liberated territories presented complex administrative and security challenges. In this environment, NKVD barrier troops were required to adapt their methods, shifting from strict disciplinary enforcement toward a broader focus on support, stabilization, and control during the final years of the conflict. One of the most significant adaptive challenges arose during the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. This operation moved faster and farther than almost any previous Red Army campaign, with Soviet units advancing up to 500 kilometers in less than 3 weeks. The rapid tempo of movement overwhelmed traditional supply routes, created gaps between echelons, and led to large numbers of soldiers becoming temporarily separated from their units. Barrier detachments stationed along major communication routes, particularly river crossings and road networks, were responsible for intercepting these stragglers, organizing them into temporary reserve formations, and preventing unauthorized withdrawals under the stress of German counterattacks. NKVD reports from this period indicate that during the first month of the offensive, detachments screened more than 38,000 personnel across the 1st Belarusian and 1st Ukrainian fronts. Roughly 85% were returned to their parent units. The remainder were assigned to rear area duties or penal companies. The rapid advance across Poland also required NKVD forces to assume greater responsibility for securing rear areas. Soviet command feared the possibility of enemy infiltrators or sabotage teams operating behind advancing Soviet formations, which created additional pressure on barrier troops to monitor traffic, verify identities, and control movement across newly liberated zones. The chaotic conditions in cities like Warsaw, Łódź, and Krakow, where infrastructure had been devastated and local administrative structures were fragile, compelled NKVD detachments to prevent looting, secure supply depots, and support the establishment of local authorities aligned with Soviet interests. In practice, this meant erecting checkpoints at key intersections, screening returning civilians, and monitoring the flow of displaced persons. The psychological toll on Red Army soldiers also required new forms of intervention. After years of exhausting combat, many frontline troops struggled with fatigue, trauma, and declining discipline. Political officers and NKVD units reported rising cases of unauthorized absence during rest periods, as well as instances of soldiers wandering away from their units after intense engagements. Barrier detachments began to include more medical staff, clerks and political personnel to evaluate intercepted soldiers and determine appropriate assignments. NKVD memoranda from February 1945 emphasized the importance of distinguishing between exhaustion, confusion, and deliberate desertion, reflecting a more pragmatic approach shaped by the need to preserve manpower during the final push toward Berlin. Meanwhile, in the southern sector, during the Budapest offensive and the subsequent operations in Hungary and Austria, NKVD barrier troops contended with a different set of challenges. The Battle of Budapest, which ended in February 1945, involved some of the most destructive urban fighting of the European War. Soviet units suffered heavy casualties during repeated assaults on German and Hungarian positions, which created high rates of battlefield disorganization. NKVD detachments in the Budapest area reported screening more than 28,000 personnel during December 1944, February 1945, many of whom had been caught in urban terrain without clear communication lines. Their efforts contributed indirectly to maintaining pressure on encircled German forces by ensuring that dislocated soldiers could be reorganized and returned to battle. Adaptation also involved coping with enemy tactics designed to exploit Soviet vulnerabilities. German forces in early 1945 increasingly relied on small mobile groups to disrupt Soviet rear areas, destroy supply convoys, and create confusion during withdrawals. Barrier troops were therefore assigned not only to discipline enforcement, but also to combat these raiding groups. In several documented cases, particularly near Gdansk, Königsberg, and the approaches to the Oder, NKVD detachments engaged directly in firefights with German units attempting to escape encirclement or sabotage Soviet communication lines. These engagements, though not large in scale, reflected the expanding military role NKVD troops played during the chaotic final phase of the war. One of the most significant adaptive tasks for barrier units was the reorganization of liberated populations. In Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, and parts of the Baltics, millions of civilians were returning to destroyed homes or fleeing areas of continued fighting. NKVD detachments were tasked with identifying suspected collaborators, screening displaced persons, and ensuring secure passage for Red Army logistics columns. Reports from the Second Belarusian Front indicated that during early 1945, NKVD units processed more than 120,000 civilians moving behind the front. Their responsibilities included preventing sabotage, ensuring compliance with military transport regulations, and coordinating with local administrations installed by advancing Soviet forces. The discipline of Soviet troops also required continuous attention. After years of brutal fighting and exposure to atrocities committed by occupying forces, Red Army soldiers sometimes engaged in retaliatory violence, uncontrolled looting, or assaults on civilians. NKVD barrier troops, in coordination with military prosecutors, were tasked with identifying and detaining personnel engaged in unauthorized acts. Internal NKVD documents note that between January and March 1945, more than 4,000 Red Army soldiers were detained for criminal behavior unrelated to military operations. This function reflected a broadening of NKVD responsibilities into military policing, especially in areas where conventional military commands struggled to maintain order. Despite these adaptations, tensions persisted between Red Army commanders and NKVD personnel. Some officers expressed frustration that barrier detachments slowed troop movements by establishing too many checkpoints. Others argued that NKVD screening procedures were essential for preventing confusion during rapid advances. The effectiveness of coordination varied across fronts. On the First Belarusian Front, cooperation was generally strong, while on the Second Ukrainian Front, disagreements over command responsibilities led to documented delays in rear area stabilization efforts. By the spring of 1945, NKVD barrier troops had become a multifaceted institution capable of executing a wide range of operational tasks. They performed traditional enforcement functions, suppressed unauthorized withdrawals, ensured the movement of reinforcements, secured communication lines, and handled the escalating complexities of rear area administration. Their ability to adapt to new challenges contributed to the Red Army's overall operational effectiveness during the final months of the war. This phase illustrated how barrier detachments evolved from emergency measures into instruments of comprehensive organizational control, a transformation driven by both wartime necessity and the Soviet leadership's enduring commitment to centralized authority and discipline. The final turning points of the war placed NKVD barrier troops in circumstances that tested their institutional purpose more severely than at any previous stage. Although the Red Army was advancing rapidly into the heart of the German Reich by early 1945, the Soviet command understood that the most dangerous moment of a long campaign often came when victory appeared imminent. Exhaustion, overextension, and rising expectations created vulnerabilities that could undermine operational momentum. NKVD barrier detachments, now deeply embedded within the military system, were assigned to prevent those vulnerabilities from turning into operational failures. Their responsibilities during this climactic stage involved managing large-scale withdrawals, confronting sudden German counterattacks, stabilizing confused sectors, and preventing the collapse of cohesion as Soviet forces approached Berlin. One of the most critical turning points occurred during the East Pomeranian and East Prussian operations in February and March 1945. Although Soviet command initially intended to drive directly toward Berlin, fierce German resistance along the Baltic coast forced Stavka to divert major forces northward. Soviet divisions advancing into Pomerania encountered well-prepared German defensive belts, harsh winter weather, and civilian evacuations that clogged vital routes. NKVD barrier troops were deployed behind frontline armies to stop unauthorized withdrawals during these unexpectedly strong German counterattacks. NKVD reports from the Second Belarusian Front document the interception of more than 26,000 personnel during February alone, including soldiers separated from their units by German breakout attempts and others who had retreated under heavy artillery fire. The turning point in East Prussia also tested barrier troops. The battles for Königsberg and the Samland Peninsula involved house-to-house fighting, unexpected German local counteroffensives, and high Soviet casualty rates. NKVD detachments responded by securing rear sectors, preventing panicked retreats through narrow urban corridors, and organizing stragglers into improvised reserve companies. In March 1945, NKVD units on the 3rd Belarusian Front recorded screening over 19,000 soldiers who had been displaced during the intense urban fighting. This reorganization allowed Soviet commanders to sustain pressure on German defenders without requiring reinforcements from other sectors. The approach to the Oder River in early 1945 introduced a new level of operational complexity. Soviet armies advancing across Poland toward the German heartland experienced rapid overextension, leaving gaps between assault echelons and follow-up forces. German counterattacks near Küstrin and Frankfurt on Oder created temporary crises that threatened to delay or disrupt the final Soviet offensive toward Berlin. During these engagements, NKVD barrier detachments played a crucial role in managing the flow of troops attempting to cross the frozen Oder, preventing uncontrolled retreats when parts of the Red Army were forced back from exposed bridgeheads. NKVD reports from the 1st Belarusian Front indicate that during February-March 1945, more than 35,000 personnel were screened on the approaches to the Oder, with most returned to their units after verification. One of the most significant turning points arrived during the Battle of Seelow Heights in April 1945. As the Red Army launched the final offensive on Berlin, the intensity of German defensive fire, particularly from concentrated artillery and anti-tank positions, caused local breakdowns in Soviet formations. Several divisions encountered difficulties coordinating assaults in fog, darkness, and smoke. NKVD barrier detachments took positions behind key assault corridors, reorganizing disoriented infantry, preventing isolated elements from withdrawing without orders, and managing the heavy flow of wounded crossing back through choke points. According to NKVD operational summaries, more than 14,000 personnel were intercepted and processed during the first 3 days of the Berlin offensive. Many of these were soldiers from rifle divisions that had temporarily lost contact with their command structures during the intense fighting. Another crucial turning point occurred when German forces attempted multiple breakout operations from encircled pockets such as Breslau, Danzig, and the Halbe pocket. These breakout attempts created sudden, violent crises behind Soviet lines. NKVD detachments were often among the first to respond, not only intercepting Soviet soldiers separated by the German attacks, but also engaging fleeing Wehrmacht units. In several documented cases, NKVD barrier troops formed defensive lines to protect supply depots or headquarters from German assault groups. During the Halbe pocket breakout in late April 1945, NKVD detachments of the 1st Ukrainian Front reported more than 900 casualties in direct combat against German forces attempting to penetrate Soviet lines. Managing captured enemy personnel became a major responsibility during these turning points. As German formations collapsed, thousands of surrendering soldiers and officers attempted to move towards Soviet lines, sometimes overwhelming the capacity of frontline units. Barrier detachments established temporary detention zones to separate Wehrmacht personnel from Soviet troops and to prevent confusion on critical supply routes. During the East Prussian collapse, NKVD records show that more than 60,000 German prisoners were processed in areas where barrier troops operated. This role became increasingly important as the fighting neared Berlin, where the rapid disintegration of German forces created complex situations requiring immediate security responses. The turning point phase also revealed internal tensions within the Red Army. The rapid pace of operations, the long duration of the war, and the harsh winter conditions produced increasing levels of exhaustion and psychological stress. NKVD detachments recorded rising cases of soldiers abandoning weapons, wandering away from units, or becoming immobilized by combat fatigue. Although most of these personnel were not deserters in the traditional sense, Barrier troops were responsible for sorting them, stabilizing them, and returning them to functioning units when possible. The emphasis on reorganization rather than punishment reflected a pragmatic shift in Soviet priorities. With the end of the war in sight, preserving fighting strength mattered more than strict ideological enforcement. The final turning point came with the encirclement and fall of Berlin. NKVD barrier troops operated behind Soviet storming groups, securing logistics routes, maintaining order among the massive influx of prisoners and civilians, and ensuring that no collapse occurred behind the assault divisions. In the chaotic final days of urban combat, NKVD detachments screened thousands of Red Army personnel who had become separated or disoriented in the city's devastated streets. Their role ensured that the final Soviet offensive remained cohesive despite heavy casualties and the intensity of house-to-house fighting. By the time Berlin fell on May 2, 1945, NKVD barrier troops had completed their most extensive and complex phase of wartime service. They had played indispensable roles in preventing operational breakdowns during the final battles of the European War, stabilizing critical sectors, managing the collapse of German forces, and maintaining the internal cohesion of Soviet armies at moments when disorganization could have delayed victory. The main task of barrier detachments in this phase was to impose order on an environment where entire cities were collapsing, transportation networks were failing, and both soldiers and civilians were moving in uncontrolled masses. Their responsibilities expanded to include the stabilization of captured regions, the processing of hundreds of thousands of prisoners, the control of looting and reprisals, and the management of disorganized Soviet troops who struggled to maintain cohesion during the final weeks of combat. In Germany's interior, the rapid Soviet advances created enormous logistical and administrative challenges. Cities such as Breslau, Danzig, Glogau, and Königsberg had suffered prolonged sieges, leaving them filled with displaced civilians, destroyed infrastructure, and scattered pockets of resistance. NKVD barrier troops were tasked with securing vital routes through these urban areas to prevent Soviet supply breakdowns. During the fall of Breslau in May 1945, for example, NKVD documents record that barrier detachments screened more than 21,000 Soviet soldiers moving through the ruined city while simultaneously managing the movement of over 80,000 German civilians and military prisoners. The objective was to prevent congestion on key supply roads and ensure that retreating German groups could not blend into refugee flows and strike at Soviet logistics columns. As Soviet forces pushed deeper into the German heartland, barrier detachments also became crucial in preventing irregular violence by both Soviet troops and local German militias. In cities such as Stettin, Liegnitz, and Frankfurt on Oder, civilian groups attempted to evacuate in desperation, often blocking military traffic. German Volkssturm units launched scattered attacks on Soviet administrative points even after the front line had passed. NKVD barrier troops responded by establishing controlled corridors, disarming militia members, and regulating the mass movement of civilians to reduce chaos. In the Stettin region, NKVD detachments recorded confiscating more than 12,000 weapons, including rifles, pistols, and improvised explosives, from civilians and militia groups during April 1945 alone. This disarmament significantly reduced the risk of rear-line ambushes against Soviet convoys. An additional priority in this stage was the handling of the rapidly increasing number of German prisoners of war. The collapse of the Wehrmacht meant that entire battalions and regiments were attempting to surrender simultaneously. Frontline units lacked the staff to process them, forcing NKVD barrier troops to establish temporary collection and interrogation centers. Although Soviet command opposed criminal behavior, the sheer spread of forces across devastated German regions made discipline difficult to maintain. Barrier troops were tasked with locating, screening, and returning these dispersed soldiers to their units. In April 1945, NKVD reports from the Second Belarusian Front show that more than 17,000 Soviet personnel were intercepted while away from their assigned formations without authorization, most due to exhaustion or confusion rather than deliberate desertion. A significant responsibility of barrier detachments during this phase was the regulation of reprisals and the prevention of uncontrolled violence against civilians. As the Red Army advanced into Germany, acts of revenge by Soviet troops became a serious concern for the High Command, which feared such incidents could lead to diplomatic complications or slow the pace of operations. NKVD barrier troops were ordered to prevent unauthorized executions, looting, and destruction of property. Reports from the Berlin and Brandenburg regions show numerous interventions by NKVD units to stop unauthorized shootings or pillaging. Although such incidents could not be entirely eradicated, barrier detachments succeeded in reducing their scale by establishing visible patrols and securing key urban districts immediately after their capture. Managing communications and preventing misinformation also became essential. As Soviet forces advanced through regions with damaged infrastructure, rumors spread quickly among both Soviet troops and German civilians. NKVD barrier units provided updated information to Red Army soldiers about new assignments, regrouping points, and expected movements. They also worked with Soviet political departments to distribute official announcements in newly captured areas to clarify the terms of surrender, curfews, and patrol responsibilities. Effective communication helped reduce the risk of panic when local German garrisons mounted unexpected resistance or when Soviet forces temporarily lost contact with higher headquarters during urban operations. In addition to their internal security tasks, barrier detachments played a crucial logistical role. As Soviet supply columns moved into Germany, they faced challenges such as destroyed bridges, blocked roads, and massive traffic congestion. NKVD units coordinated with engineering battalions to redirect traffic, secure temporary bridges, and keep vital ammunition and fuel convoys moving. During the Berlin operation, NKVD units helped maintain order at critical choke points, such as the Oder River crossings, where hundreds of military vehicles were passing each hour. Their interventions prevented traffic jams that could have delayed the delivery of artillery shells and fuel needed for the final assault. By the final weeks of the war, their responsibilities had expanded far beyond their original purpose, transforming them into a critical administrative and security component of Soviet military power during the disintegration of Nazi Germany. The end of the war in Europe fundamentally altered both the structure and the mission of NKVD barrier troops. With the capitulation of Germany on 8 May 1945, the Red Army no longer faced the immediate threat of large-scale desertion, unauthorized withdrawal, or rear area penetration by enemy forces. The dissolution of the front line created a vast occupational zone stretching across eastern Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Austria, and the Baltic states. NKVD barrier units established control points along major routes, rail stations, and administrative boundaries. At these posts, they screened travelers, separated civilians from military personnel, prevented the unauthorized transfer of weapons, and recorded personal data to reduce the likelihood of infiltrators or escaped war criminals passing unnoticed. Reports from summer 1945 show that in the Soviet occupation zone of Germany alone, NKVD barrier detachments registered more than 1.2 million displaced civilians and screened approximately 380,000 German POWs awaiting transfer. In parallel with population control, NKVD barrier troops were deeply involved in the repatriation of Soviet citizens. Millions of Red Army soldiers, forced laborers, and civilians had been scattered across German territory. Stalin's government demanded strict verification to determine whether individuals had collaborated with the Germans, deserted, or otherwise violated Soviet law during the occupation. Barrier detachments managed collection points where Soviet returnees were interrogated, sorted, and prepared for transfer to filtration camps. Records from mid-1945 indicate that NKVD personnel processed approximately 4.2 million Soviet returnees in the months following the German surrender. The majority were cleared and allowed to reintegrate, but a significant number, tens of thousands, were detained for further investigation. Barrier troops did not make final judicial decisions, but they provided the initial layer of administrative control that enabled the Soviet state to determine the fate of each returnee. The demobilization of the Red Army required another major role for NKVD barrier units. By early 1946, the Soviet Union planned to release more than 8 million soldiers from active duty. In territories designated for long-term Soviet influence, primarily the eastern regions of Germany, Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, the NKVD played a central role in supporting communist parties, stabilizing security institutions, and removing individuals considered hostile to Soviet interests. Barrier detachments assisted by conducting targeted identity screenings, securing administrative centers, and preventing unauthorized movement across internal borders. In the Soviet zone of Germany, for example, barrier troops monitored travel between districts to prevent former Nazi officials or military personnel from attempting to escape denazification measures. Between late 1945 and early 1947, NKVD reports document more than 46,000 arrests of individuals classified as war criminals, SS personnel, Gestapo collaborators, or members of banned organizations. These operations relied heavily on the logistical and screening capabilities originally developed for wartime barrier work. Another significant responsibility involved the security of transportation networks during Reconstruction. Much of Eastern Europe's rail system had been destroyed or severely damaged by wartime operations. These lines were essential for supplying occupation authorities, transporting prisoners, and enabling the movement of rebuilding materials. NKVD barrier troops patrolled major junctions, guarded bridges, inspected rail cars, and prevented sabotage in regions where anti-Soviet partisan activity persisted. In territories such as western Ukraine, Lithuania, and parts of Poland, armed resistance movements continued to operate throughout the late 1940s. Barrier detachments coordinated with NKVD and MGB operational groups to protect critical supply lines from attacks. Statistics from 1945-1947 show that hundreds of sabotage attempts, bombings of tracks, derailments, or ambushes of supply trains were recorded annually, requiring constant vigilance.